GST.
Chair.
The Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
Mr. Chair, I want to pick up where my colleague David Parker left off. Sorry, was there a funny noise over there? And that is in respect of the chattering classes. Right? Sorry, it was that gracious member, Maggie Barry, I forgot. The gracious member. What I'd like to ask the Minister and the Chair is this. I could not find, it may exist, in the regulatory impact statement or in the report bag, any quantification of the saving and compliance costs that these clauses, both the parts and clauses that we've already processed, and in Part 4, particularly 137, I think, was the clause that Mr Parker was referring to, because under Mr Parker's argument, I believe he's correct, that actually against accounting principle and advice, the late payment, even a minor late payment by an SME or business will incur GST. So on that basis, that is going to be a compliance cost for small business. So I'd like to ask the Minister, he may like to interrupt me and take a call, where in the legislation of the regulatory impact statement is there a quantification of the compliance costs that will be saved from this piece of legislation? Is there an estimate? We're told, and what is the fiscal cost of 137 and other clauses to small business? Now, it may be, and I'd like also an answer to this, that the Minister of Small Business, the Honourable John Banks, has provided a report, a cabinet paper or whatever to this Minister on the issue of compliance costs, because of course the Minister for Small Business has the Small Business Advisory Group or Task Force, whatever it's called. We set it up when we were in government, and part of that agency's or that group's mandate is to recommend to the Honourable John Banks, Minister for SMEs, where savings can be made and compliance costs reduced. So given that we now have a proposition before us in 137 that against accounting principle, against private sector accounting advice, against advice that said payment of penalties should be zero rated, we now have a GST imposed on that. So can the Minister tell us, one, how much will this save SMEs, this bill, and two, can he quantify it, and three, what is the fiscal impact, the negative fiscal impact on SMEs of Clause 137? Would the Minister like to proffer an answer? I'll let him finish his glass of water. No. Silence. Silence. So either the Minister doesn't know, and hey, nobody knows everything except Maggie Barry, or the Minister could take some advice, he could turn to his right and ask his officials in the regulatory impact statement, and there are a number of them, a whole host of them, there doesn't appear to be any attempt to quantify what is the nature of the saving and compliance costs that this legislation will render unto SMEs or businesses as a whole. My colleague makes the point. Of course, now we know, and we've received no argument to the contrary from the Chief Whip, who in his own lifetime and in this chamber in the last hour is a resident expert on this legislation. So if the Minister doesn't know, could Maggie Barry or John Hayes or the Chief Whip tell us how much increase in compliance costs Clause 37 will have on small business? None. None. Oh, none, he says. Well, if that's the case, could the Minister with his officials, does he concur? Is there any evidence? Or is this another one of the Chief Whip? He had he attempted about half an hour ago to wax eloquently and was wrong on the nature of this bill in Part 3. So now we're going to rely on every SME in the country is going to hang on the words of the Chief Government Whip that there will be no increase in compliance cost for your small business or your medium-sized business. None. So maybe he is pitching to be Minister of Small Business, that is true. Mr Woodhouse might well be. There could well be, I don't know, I can't see into the future, but there could well be a vacancy opening up in that portfolio real quick, I suspect. So all we've got tonight is Mr Woodhouse, the Chief Government Whip, who is not the Minister, does not have access to the advice, so every SME in the land can rest easy because Mr Woodhouse has said there is no increase in compliance cost either from 137 or this legislation. So I invite colleagues, especially those from Dunedin, to write that quote of Mr Woodhouse's down, etch that into the memory, because that will come back to haunt him. Mr Chair.
Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
Mr Chair, he looks forward to it, he says. Well, so do we. Because we have no report from the Minister of Small Business that in any way, if there is one that exists, I know Mr Banks was a tad preoccupied with other matters and in fairness may not have been able to sign off said report from the Small Business Advisory Group. He may not have remembered to sign it off, he may not have remembered to ask, he may not have remembered that he does have a Small Business Advisory Group. He may have signed it, well indeed, he may have signed off the advice from the Small Business Advisory Group, and it could well be wrong, and therefore the Minister and the Chair may have refused to have read it in case maybe it was wrong, but he'll take Mr Banks's word for it that all is well in SME land. So every SME in New Zealand will hang on the word of the Chief Government Whip that this legislation and Clause 137 will in no way increase their compliance costs.
That must be wrong.
And that must be wrong. But I know they'll all be sleeping easy in their beds tonight as they awake tomorrow morning and proceed to the computer or the ledger or the journal to do their tax. They will know that this change against accounting advice, against accounting principle, will in no way impinge on their fiscal position or the hours they spend doing their tax return, and in no way complicate their entrepreneurial lives one iota. Well, all I'd like from the Minister and the Chair, and I see it's the Commerce Minister, Mr Foss, who's probably far more qualified than the last two invisible folks that we've had, Ministers and the Chair, maybe he could turn to his officials and actually ask and verify or quantify for us the compliance impact of this clause. We'll try again, shall we? Would the Minister like to answer the question? No? Silence is deafening. Silence is deafening. So we're paying these guys $250,000 to sit in a chair so he can do the crossword or Sudoku or whatever it is there. $250,000 to sit there, and throughout this taxation debate, which has gone on since about 5:30, I don't believe there has been one call, apart from the initial call from Peter Dunn, from any minister to answer any of the questions in this legislation. Been a lot of interjections, and a bit of banter and a bit of fun from the other side, but not one answer to any question. Although, colleagues, I did make a breakthrough, Peter Dunn in the chair. I did ask him if I could ask a question of the officials. The officials gave me a very diligent answer. I'm gratified for that. But the officials, I wager, are not sitting there on $250,000 salary with a warrant, with a ministerial office and a BMW to boot. So the question is, if the minister's not prepared to answer any questions, what is he here for? Could we give him the night off? Could he take an early shower? Maybe it'd be a bit more productive. Because, sir, there have been serious issues raised throughout this legislation. Maybe you could go and have a wee lie down and a wee kip and a nice little tot of whiskey, and that'd be far more productive than sitting here sort of pretending to be a sort of granite statue. Because, or maybe you could just stand up and say, I'm not prepared to answer any questions, or we didn't on part 1, 2, 3 or 4, we won't answer any on 5, so give up. Now, we won't give up, but that would tell the New Zealand people exactly what they're paying him $250,000 for. To do his crossword, work out, have a look at tomorrow's menu or breakfast menu or whatever it is, or work out the diary, or work out the shopping list. Because this is actually serious stuff. Serious stuff. I've been a small business person, very limited small business it was, reasonably successful, pretty limited. I had the luxury and the resources to put all the receipts into a briefcase, hand it to the accountant and say, can you sort of untangle Spaghetti Junction and make sure I comply with my obligations? The truth is that most SMEs, it's either the other half, the husband or the wife, that sits there at night under dim light doing the government work for them, working out the GST, the provisional tax and all these things. And I would have thought if we could do anything in this legislation to give them back a couple of minutes of their life, maybe an hour, because if you put a dollar rate on that, if you put a dollar value on that, how many hours they spend behind the desk as opposed to in the workshop or behind the counter growing the business, that's actually a real cost to a small business. They can't charge out their hourly rate to do the government's work for them. They just got to do it. They've just got to eat it and take it. So I would have thought at the very least they require some sort of basic assurance or explanation. Mr Goldsmith, he has written a few books on this sort of thing, I suspect. He might be able to give us an assurance. Somebody from the FEC, Mr Hayes, Mr Hayes, I'm sure a resident expert on many things might be able to give us an assurance in respect of compliance costs and its fiscal impact. Maggie Barry? No. We'll move on. So they are the questions before the Minister. He could take a call, he could answer
Dr.
those.
David Clark.
Mr Chair, I rise to continue in this debate because it's shaping into quite an